of their money in salaries, rather than going to project missions. I, in good faith, cannot do that. I think we should set a limit on administrative expenses before we get down money to anybody.
In talking with Ms. Freeland, she indicates that as of this minute, they have the equivalent of 2.3 employees. And as an example, for next Tuesday's voting, they'll be coordinating the volunteers for 164 sites with 15 to 20 volunteers per site. And whether this is once or twice a year with the other educational stuff that they do, they don't have a budget that would allow them to have 25 or 30 employees, obviously, and they do with what they have, is my understanding. Last Friday, in the News and Record on the editorial page, we have an editorial which is entitled "We All Win with Kids Voting," and it goes down talking about their opinion on the benefit of the project itself, and shaping kids and getting them familiar with the voting process. And I'll just stop right there for a few minutes.
Well, I think there's also two issues here. We use kids voting as the test case and to determine what were the issues that were raised when we actually tested our process with an actual application. So the first questions for you all, which I think was what Ms. Strickland was getting at, is that we should set thresholds for what would be a normally acceptable amount of funds that would go towards administrative expenses. There's always opportunity for exception if there is reason presented of why there should be an exception. But I think that's the first question, is should we establish an administrative threshold, I think is what Ms. Strickland was getting towards. Not necessarily specific to kids voting. That's a separate voting issue. You know, when you vote on the individual request for funds, as to why you would or would not support them. The first question is administratively, are we going to set a limit on what costs should be with, for salaries within an organization?
And I think the question there is, what is the organization providing? Are they providing goods or are they providing services? And we need to look at the labor-intensive nature of what they're providing. And in a situation like this, there are countless volunteers that go into manning the polls. Those figures, those dollars are not calculated as an in-kind donation per se. So we don't know the amount of labor that is actually donated for this. Because if you look on their website, they talk about the numbers of volunteers that have to man the polls that day. And it was an astronomical number of volunteers manning all the polls for all the kids voting. So it's one of those things where it's hard to say a percentage threshold because it depends on the organization. This kind of organization, you're going to have the main expense is going to be salaries, because what are they providing? They're providing the service of educating the kids, of being there at the polls and being there when the kids come to vote, versus another organization that may be providing a product. And then their expenses may be product related and not salary related. So, each organization is going to have to be looked at differently depending on what they're providing. So that's where it's going to make it a little difficult to set a percentage threshold of salaries, because it could be an organization, for instance, maybe senior resources, where they're all senior services related expenses, and most of those are salary, whether it's consultation, the doctors, whatever they're providing to those individuals, there are going to be a lot of salary-related expenses.
But that's a multi-million dollar organization. They can take in over $3 million a year, and I think their executive director salary is like $60-some-thousand. So what I'm seeing here, it does not correlate with what I see in much larger nonprofits. And I realize that Kids Voting is providing a service, but they're providing a service that the parent should be providing. I took my child to vote when she was an infant. She was on my hip. When she was big enough to walk, she walked beside me into the booth. When she was big enough to know what was going on, then I told her what was going on. So they're providing the service that the parent should be providing. In fact, we're all sitting up here with less than 30% of the voters having voted for us. Maybe we should have an adults voting that we contribute to also.
And that was one of the things that surprised me as well. The kids' voting turnout was about the same as the adult turnout, 16% for the kids and 18% for the adults in November 2007. That was pretty surprising to me.
Well, I'm not comfortable giving taxpayer money to anybody when if we're giving them $500, then over $250 of it is going to pay somebody's salary. I'm not comfortable doing that.
The only question I have for this specific one, the kids voting, and I look at BF Jeanswear News and Record, State of North Carolina, Community Foundation, Junior League, are any other municipalities contributing towards that? Did you see anything on the list, Bruce? I didn't really see that, or I didn't know if we got a complete list of where they get money.
I know Guilford County used to, and with
They
funding,
lost their Guilford County funding.
funding cuts, they
And
lost
they're
Guilford
usually
County.
funding, Dana, because they don't provide audits.
And that was the other question, you know, that if not, why? And I think that's, you know, I think it's a good and valid thing to have, but the question is, do we need to put money from our taxpayers back into it, is the question.
And they actually stopped getting an audit because they lost the Guilford County funding, because Guilford County required an audit, and audits, as you well know, are quite expensive. So since they were no longer required to get an audit, they dropped down to, I think it was a review, if I recall correctly. So they were gonna get a review instead of an audit, and that was a result of losing the Guilford County funding.
So it's a catch-22.
Town Pleasant Gardens funding.
I don't recall, it's been so long since I looked at this thing, I don't recall all the municipalities. I know that Guilford County was at one point.
Guilford County was giving $10,000. So they've lost a whole lot more money than they would have even come close to losing had they done an audit. I don't understand why they're not doing an audit.
Guilford County cut many nonprofits 18 months ago. So I don't know if that's because of the lack of an audit or the fact that Guilford County cut all the nonprofits.
It wasn't the result of the lack of an audit because they stopped the audit after they lost the funding. That's expressly stated in their minutes. As soon as they lost the funding, that's when they dropped the audit because of the cost of an audit versus a review. And, you know, that's part of the course with nonprofits. They usually don't get a audit because of the cost of an audit. They usually will do a review, if anything. And there are some out there that don't even do that, which come in on the back end of some of those and not a good, pretty picture.
So what you want tonight is a motion to approve or disapprove $500 funding for.
Well, I guess that's ancillary to the main point, which is getting a process in place for the CBOs. And since we have now at least reviewed one, that would be, the next step would be actually getting a motion on the kids voting. But the first, the main reason is to actually get a process for this review in the future, and who will be doing the review and how it's done and what we use. And I guess to even amend this policy or potentially the checklist for the future, do we want to add items to the checklist? Because, you know, recent financial statement would be a good thing. We never had that on our list, but I think that makes sense. Financial procedures and policies.
And current tax returns, we don't have the current tax returns, John. We don't have anything past 2006.
Well, I think that's a wording issue.
Yes.
What ours says is a copy of the most recently filed. What we want is the most, you know, whatever is required. If it's an extension, it's an extension. So I think it's a wording issue there to make sure that we understand that.
And I did, the revised checklist that I came up with did have some suggestions for items that were missing from our checklist and items that did not appear in the package, so I did add some of those. Now, the copy of the most recently filed IRS Form 990, I did not change that, but I agree that that needs to be changed. It needs to be, like Michael said, something requesting their most recent or extension, most recent one that was due for an extension.
Can we change the most recent to